The snow had been falling for days, blanketing the quiet mountain neighborhood in a pristine, untouched layer of white. Icicles hung from the eaves like crystal daggers, and the morning sun reflected off the snow, making everything sparkle as if the world had been frozen in a perfect photograph. But beneath this picture-perfect scene, tension simmered. Tension that everyone in the neighborhood had learned to call Karen. HOA Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was a force of chaos, wrapped in designer winter coats and a smug sense of entitlement. She had a reputation for calling the police over the tiniest infractions, for filing complaints about leaves in gutters, snow piles that slightly blocked sidewalks, and even for children making too much noise in their own yards. Most neighbors had learned to tiptoe around her, keeping their property pristine and their voices low. But today, Karen had something new in mind, something no one saw coming, something reckless. She had somehow acquired a small stash of fireworks, illegal in many parts of the state, and extremely dangerous in winter conditions. And in classic Karen fashion, she believed she could use them wherever she wanted, regardless of rules or common sense. The target? A wide, snow-packed hill that ran dangerously close to the center of the block. It all began in the mid-morning hours. The neighborhood was quiet. Most residents were inside, sipping coffee or watching the snowfall. But from the corner of the street, a faint crackle and whistle pierced the silence. Curiosity turned to alarm as a single spark shot into the sky. Then another, and another. HOA Karen stood at the top of the hill, grinning as she launched firework after firework onto the thick snowpack below, completely ignoring the potential consequences. At first it seemed like harmless fun. The fireworks lit the sky with bright colors, casting vivid reflections across the icy landscape. But the snow beneath her was old, layered, and unstable. Experts would later describe it as a perfect storm for disaster. Recent snowfall on a fragile base layer, heavy accumulation on the slope, and the slightest disturbance could send it all tumbling downhill. And that's exactly what happened. Within seconds, a deep rumble shook the street. Snow groaned and cracked as if protesting Karen's reckless display. Her laughter quickly turned into a scream as the first wall of white surged down the hill, faster than anyone could react. Cars, fences, and decorations were swallowed in an instant. The neighborhood had become a living avalanche scene. The avalanche thundered down the hill with a terrifying force. A wall of snow and ice crashing into fences, cars, and anything else in its path. HOA Karen's screams echoed over the roar, cutting through the panic that had begun to spread through the neighborhood. Windows rattled in their frames, dogs barked frantically, and neighbors who had been enjoying a quiet winter morning suddenly found themselves in the middle of a natural disaster they had never expected. Within seconds, the snowpack reached the lower street, burying parked cars under several feet of heavy, wet snow. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, had just stepped outside to check on her mailbox when the avalanche swept past. She barely managed to dive behind her garage, feeling the icy wall rush past her knees and chest. Her heart pounded as she watched debris and snow collide like a giant, unstoppable wave. HOA Karen, frozen at the top of the hill in a mixture of terror and disbelief, struggled to comprehend what was happening. The fireworks had been supposed to be her grand spectacle, a way to show off her daring streak to the neighborhood. Not a disaster waiting to happen. Now she was the epicenter of chaos, the instigator of a winter catastrophe that would be talked about for years. Across the street, several neighbors grabbed shovels, snowblowers, and even brooms in a desperate attempt to slow the snow's spread. They shouted warnings to one another, trying to coordinate efforts while avoiding being swept up by the still-moving mass of ice and snow. Cars that had been parked too close to the slope were completely covered, their owners frantically checking for damage as snow crashed against garages and fences. Some children had ventured outside despite the snowstorm, their curiosity quickly turning into fear as the avalanche roared past. Parents scooped them up, shielding their heads as chunks of ice and snow flew dangerously close. A few brave souls attempted to capture the moment on their phones, but it quickly became clear that survival was more important than content creation. In a nearby driveway, Mr. Patel's mailbox was crushed, sending letters and parcels flying into the snow. A Christmas decoration display that had taken weeks to assemble was demolished within seconds. HOA Karen's expression shifted from shock to panic as she realized the magnitude of what she had done. Her bravado had vanished, replaced with the cold, harsh reality of nature's unforgiving power. And yet the avalanche wasn't finished. Smaller slides continued to branch off from the main flow, sending snow spilling onto sidewalks and yards that had seemed safe just moments before. The neighborhood had transformed into a winter battlefield, a chaotic scene of destruction, fear, and disbelief, all triggered by one person's reckless decision. The avalanche had finally slowed, leaving a chaotic, snow-covered landscape in its wake. Cars were crushed under layers of heavy snow. Fences were twisted like paper, and yards that had once been pristine were now unrecognizable. The neighborhood, which had only hours ago been calm and peaceful, now looked like a scene from a disaster movie. Smoke from chimneys mixed with the cold winter air, and the distant wail of a police siren hinted that help was on the way. HOA Karen stood frozen on the top of the hill, a mix of fear, guilt, and disbelief etched on her face. For the first time, she seemed completely powerless, realizing that her careless actions had consequences far beyond her control. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around her now openly glared, some shaking their heads, others shouting in frustration. The snow that had been a winter wonderland just moments ago was now a frozen reminder of her recklessness. Residents quickly organized, trying to assess damage and help one another. Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Patel were busy digging out their cars, while the children were gathered indoors, wrapped in blankets and comforted with hot cocoa. Conversations buzzed. With disbelief and anger, no one could understand how a simple act of fireworks could have caused such destruction. Some neighbors called emergency services, reporting partially buried vehicles and damaged property. Meanwhile, HOA Karen's phone was blowing up with calls from the HOA board, law enforcement, and even local news reporters who had caught wind of the disaster. Her confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread as she realized that accountability was unavoidable. Every moment she hesitated, more neighbors began snapping photos and videos, documenting the damage for insurance purposes and, quietly, for future reminders of her recklessness. As the afternoon sun struggled through the winter clouds, people started clearing paths through the snow, rescuing trapped pets and salvaging what they could from the wreckage. The neighborhood came together in a way that had never happened before. Despite the chaos, people helped one another, forming human chains to dig out cars and move debris. It was a stark contrast to HOA Karen, who remained isolated at the top of the hill, visibly shaking as she watched the consequences of her actions unfold. By early evening, the immediate danger had passed, but the tension in the air was palpable. Conversations shifted from shock to planning. Who would repair what first? Which cars were salvageable? And most importantly, how to ensure that Karen could never repeat such a reckless stunt. Rumors spread quickly, and the story of the fireworks triggered. Avalanche was already becoming legend among the residents. Yet as snow continued to settle over the neighborhood, there was an unspoken understanding that the worst wasn't over. HOA Karen's recklessness had left a permanent mark on the community, and the question everyone was silently asking was, what would she do next? The next morning, the neighborhood woke to a surreal sight. Snow still blanketed the streets, but now debris, damaged fences, and partially buried vehicles were visible amidst the white. The aftermath of the avalanche was undeniable, and the scale of the disaster sparked a mix of awe and anger. Conversations buzzed among neighbors as they stepped outside, assessing the destruction while helping one another clean up. The sense of community, born from shared chaos, was strong, but so was the lingering resentment toward HOA Karen. Karen herself was under scrutiny like never before. Word had spread rapidly about her reckless behavior, and soon she was facing calls from local authorities, the HOA board, and even insurance companies. The fireworks she had ignited on the snowpack were not only illegal but had directly caused property damage. Photographs, videos, and eyewitness accounts from multiple neighbors left her with no plausible way to deny responsibility. The once confident, imperious Karen now faced a storm of accountability that mirrored the literal avalanche she had caused. As cleanup continued, neighbors began organizing repairs. Volunteers shoveled snow, cleared crushed mailboxes, and moved debris from driveways. People who had barely interacted before were now coordinating efforts, forming an informal support network. The neighborhood had transformed from a passive collection of individual households into a unified community, bonded by resilience and mutual aid. Even those previously intimidated by Karen felt empowered to share their experiences and warn others against such reckless behavior. Meanwhile, Karen attempted to defend herself, insisting that the disaster was an accident and that no one should blame her entirely. But the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple videos showed her launching fireworks directly onto the snow-laden hill, and interviews with neighbors confirmed the chain of events leading to the avalanche. HOA Karen's reputation, carefully cultivated over years of asserting authority, was now irreparably damaged. The community no longer saw her as a formidable figure, but as a cautionary example of entitlement, and carelessness. By evening, most of the debris had been cleared, and the neighborhood had begun to rebuild. While some fences and vehicles would take weeks or months to repair, the spirit of the community remained intact. Conversations shifted from anger toward lessons learned, respecting natural dangers, thinking before acting, and the importance of neighborly cooperation. HOA Karen's reckless stunt had inadvertently strengthened the very community she had once tried to control. In the end, the avalanche became more than just a winter disaster. It was a turning point. Karen's actions had consequences far beyond her imagination, and the neighborhood had emerged stronger, closer, and more aware of the power of nature and human recklessness. Some would call it poetic justice, others sheer luck, but one thing was certain. The story of HOA, Karen and the avalanche, would be told for years, a cautionary tale of fire, snow, and the consequences of playing with both. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more crazy HOA and Karen stories every week.